Hey everyone, welcome to Recombinant Teaching. We're going to continue our STEM course design series in this episode and talk about summative assessment. So last episode we talked about backward design, learning objectives, learning outcomes, and how important those are in the overall course design process so that you start off thinking about what you want your students to be able to do. Well, next in that process is figuring out how to measure whether or not your students can actually achieve those objectives or not. And hopefully they all can, right? We want to design courses that students can achieve those goals. And how to measure that? Well, we have to use the A word, assessment. And assessment, it's sometimes not the most fun thing that people work on with education, but it's really, really important because, again, we need to measure. We need to figure out, is our course effective or not? Are our students able to achieve those outcomes or not? So by thinking about assessment now, early in the process, we're able to figure out and determine how the rest of our course will be designed so that we can give students practice opportunities so they can do well on those assessments. And we'll talk about practice a lot moving forward in this series. But again, today we're going to focus on assessment. All right, before we dive deeper into what we mean by summative assessment, let's contrast it with something else called formative assessment. So there's these two major types, again, formative and summative. Formative tends to be a way to think about assessment for learning. So this is practice. This is small stakes or no stakes assignments, what you do in class, what you do out of class, ways for students to practice again and figure out can they or can they not do and achieve the objectives. But it is all about practice. It's typically not for a grade. It's, again, just to give students opportunities to practice their learning. So it's assessment for learning. We contrast that with summative assessment. So summative assessment is larger, bigger stakes, typically at the end of a unit or the end of the entire course. Even think about a final project or exam. We call this assessment of learning. So again, this is a way to check, can our students achieve the objectives or not? These are documented milestones throughout a course that show the assessment of a student's progress of their learning. Both are very, very, very important for designing courses that are effective. And when it comes to, again, formative assessment, that's the practice piece. We're going to talk more about that later on in this series when we talk about different activities that happen before, during, and after class. But for now, we'll talk about summative assessment. So with that as a little background, let's think about summative assessment. And I want to first start talking about this in the context of alignment. So we talked about alignment 2 episodes ago where we introduced high structure course design and how important alignment is, where we tie everything together and everything needs to be going back to those objectives. So with assessment and alignment, it's really important because if you design an assessment that is not aligned to a learning objective, well, you're measuring the wrong thing. So in a real world example, let's think about having to have an objective of fix a leaky pipe. Okay, this happens to all of us, right? Whether it's your bathroom sink, your kitchen sink, somewhere else in the house, some things leak. It just happens. It's normal with age. So with fixing a leaking pipe, if that's your objective, well, how do you actually assess whether you can fix that leaky pipe or not? Well, you get under the sink, you get on your back, you crane your neck, you hurt your neck sometimes, but you crane under there and you actually fix it, right? Well, other of you might say, I'm just going to call the plumber. Well, that's another good approach that would achieve the learning objective, right? But in either case, you're actually fixing it, you're doing it. Now, if the assessment instead was designed so that you answer multiple choice questions about fixing a pipe, is that meeting that objective of fix a leaky pipe? Kind of, right? Not really, though. It's tangential. You're answering questions about the process, maybe multiple choice questions on the type of wrench to use or maybe the source of the leak or, do you turn the water supply on or off before doing it? So yeah, it's related to it, but is it actually assessing it? I'd argue no. So you got to be, again, make sure those objectives and the assessments that follow them are tightly aligned. So if you have a hands-on objective like fix a leaky pipe, well, you better actually show that you can fix it to assess it and not have a less aligned assessment such as a multiple choice test for that. So if you have these, again, objectives that are more applied, things like deliver an oral presentation or design an experiment, these higher Bloom's levels, well, you better have the assessments that match those up really tightly too. Because if you don't, then you're not really serving the need of that objective and you're not having an aligned assessment. And then you can also think about the downstream practice opportunities that'll come with that too. And in those practice opportunities, again, we'll talk about in later episodes, but those should also be aligned to the learning objectives and give students practice so they can do well in those assessments, which again tie back into those learning objectives. Okay, so when you think about assessment, again, I gave you one concrete example there of actually getting on your back under the sink and fixing the pipe. There's lots of different types of assessments you can use in your typical STEM courses. And those range from the more traditional, so quizzes, exams, to the still traditional, but a little bit maybe more involved depending on your class size and structure and format. Maybe you have written reports, oral presentations, essays, summaries, things like that. And then you can go even further, maybe to the more novel types of assessments you might not have done before, things like authentic assessments, portfolios, group quizzes or group exams. So there's a whole host of things, and they're all in my book if you want to get a lot more detail. And I have a ton of references to support the efficacy of these different assessments in my book too, so check them out. But for now, I want to dive into a couple categories along that continuum of more traditional and then maybe to the little bit more novel. So first, quizzes and exams. These are the bread and butter of STEM courses. They're probably not going to go away anytime soon, and they're actually even coming back now when we're in the post-AI era where people want to really try to assess what do my students actually know. Well, sit down in a classroom, piece of paper and a pencil and show me what you know, right? So these in-class exams and quizzes are making a return. If they ever left, I'd argue probably not, but they seem to be gaining even more steam these days. And they can do a great service. They really can. They can really demonstrate what students know with content and skills. They can have students, give them a chance to try really high Bloom's levels. Yes, you can write high levels Bloom's multiple choice questions. Don't tell me that you can't, because you can. They might not be the greatest, but you can definitely do it. You can write higher level Bloom's questions there for multiple choice, for short answer, for labeling. Numerical problem solving is really critical for engineering. There's lots of things that you can do with pencil and paper quizzes and exams. Now, there's also a lot of problems with these, right? You think about how validated are they? Are the questions actually measuring what you intend to measure? I think about students with accommodations and extra time needs and test anxiety. That is for real. That is definitely a real thing students face. So you have to make it just part of the overall course experience. Let it be the only part of the course experience. Yeah, I had a couple classes at Penn State at college where we'd have one midterm, one final. Each was, 45 or 40% of the grade. So yeah, that's a real thing. You have one bad day, you have one bad 10-minute stretch, you're going to tank your entire course grade. So I don't want you to do that. So, make your summative assessments, if you are using quizzes and exams, part of the overall assessment landscape and profile. But speaking of that one midterm, one final idea, that's a frequency issue too. So there is a lot of literature now showing that the more frequent you have summative assessments like quizzes and exams, the better students do, because you're giving students more opportunities to showcase their learning. They're getting more opportunities to collect feedback and for you to give them feedback on how they did and learn from their mistakes. So more frequent assessment, and this could be something you do, maybe every month you have an exam, maybe every couple weeks you have a quiz, maybe even every week you have a quiz, right? Weekly quizzes are fairly popular, especially in engineering courses that I teach. And even when I was a student over 20 years ago, we had weekly quizzes. So you can think about changing the frequency of how often you have these assessments, which again has been shown beneficial for student learning because they are getting more feedback more often and they can correct themselves as they go. Imagine being a brand new student in Calc 1, first year of college. You've never had a class like this before. You walk in there and you wait until week 6 to have an exam. Okay, how are you supposed to correct yourself along the way? I'm sure there's homework and I'm sure you're doing practice problems during class, but without getting a significant amount of feedback on your performance until week 6 or sometimes even later, you're really setting yourself up for failure as a student. And honestly, as an instructor, you're setting your students up for failure too, because you're not giving those ample opportunities for feedback. So have more frequent assessment. That can be a boon. There's even literature showing that students like it more and they give higher student evaluations for what those are worth. We'll talk about that in a later episode of this podcast too. But, the student evaluations, students do say they like them better. And I know that anecdotally too from my own students. When I ask them, hey, what do you think? Do you want to have weekly quizzes where there's like 14 of them and they're all worth a little bit less of the grade? Or do you want to have these 2 or 3 giant exams and, vast majority, if not all hands shoot up quickly when they say weekly quizzes? So yeah, I know it's a little bit more stress on a week-to-week basis, but again, lower stakes, opportunities to reflect, opportunities to learn from those mistakes is really, really worth it. Okay. You can also do the group version of this. So I'm a big fan of group quizzes or exams. Now we're kind of getting from the more traditional individual quizzes exams to a little more exotic here. And with group quizzes in the literature, they're formally called 2-stage collaborative exams. What you can do is you can have students take an individual quiz or exam first, then you collect it, then you get students into groups, usually of 3, and then you pass out a new version of the quiz or exam. It could be identical, it can be slightly similar, called isomorphic, or completely different. And with these group quizzes, you're giving students a lot of opportunities to now interact. So they're building off that momentum of taking the individual one and applying that energy in a group setting. Because when are students the most excited to ever talk about our quiz or exam? It's as soon as they hit the hallway, right? You probably hear it. If you're giving a midterm and you hear the door opens, or students still in the hallway talking loudly about how it went, using some language maybe they shouldn't be using, right? And in this case, you have that energy of, hey, I just took this assessment. Let's build on that now in the group setting. So you do the individual part first. Then you get students in a group and they take it again, or again, a slightly different version, and they're ready to go. Another reason to do these is because all the time as instructors, we tell our students, you're always going to be working in teams. You're always going to be working in groups. You got to navigate group dynamics. Life is working in groups, all that, right? But then we only assess you individually. We only give you individual assignments and quizzes and exams, right? So why don't we put the money where our mouth is and say, okay, well, group dynamics are so important, teamwork's so important, let's assess your ability to work in a group. So on these group parts of these quizzes and exams, you give them one piece of paper and the students have to figure out, okay, who's going to be the writer, all right? So things like that. You have to have that group rapport well built in. So recommendations for how to make this work. And I have, I'll put a link in the show notes to a paper I published on the efficacy of these because they do work. In my own data, I've shown that students learn more in the short term and the long term. Students love them. They give high evaluations towards them. And there's a ton of literature about these group quizzes out there and group exams and show their efficacy. So check out the references in that paper and more too. But one big recommendation for how to do this is to make sure students get to practice ahead of time. So have those groups formed ahead of time. I usually share the groups with my students about a week or so ahead of time. And there's we could have a whole nother conversation on how to form groups. So I'll save that for another time too. But give them their groups ahead of time so that way they can do a practice group quiz together because they need to figure out the rapport. They need to figure out who's going to be the alpha, right? Who's going to be driving the car? Who's going to be writing on the paper? Because again, there's one sheet of paper per group. Who's going to be maybe checking calculations? Who's going to be checking time? Who's going to be asking questions, right? So you got to have group dynamics set up ahead of time because that's the biggest roadblock I see with students when they walk into a group quiz environment for the first time and they've never met their group. They don't know who these people are. That can lead to some butting heads. So make sure they get time to meet each other in class. Even when you post those groups, give 5 minutes at the end of that class to have students find each other and share text and things like that. And then they can do that practice ahead of time. There are also issues with accommodations and extra time for how to handle these. That's going to be unique for every individual institution, how you handle extra time accommodations. I will say though, in the now almost 7 years of doing these, I've had, count on one hand, number of students who want to use their accommodations on the extra time portion of a group quiz, on the group part, I should say, because they feel much more comfortable working in a group, on a team on these assessments, so they don't feel the need to want to use their accommodations. So I'll just let you know, in my case, again, very small number of students have ever asked for that. When they have asked for it, I've made it work. But again, I'll leave that up to you and your individual school and your policies for how to handle that to make it work. But the group quizzes, I'll just leave it with this, that they're incredible. The energy in the room, the momentum that students feel about it, the looks on their faces, and what they say too. So I even had a student one time after a group quiz. She walked up to me, after she turned it in, she looked me right in the eye and she said the F word right to my face. Believe it or not, I know, right? I was shocked that she said this, but she did. She looked right at me and she said, "Dr. Schaefer, That group quiz was so much fun. There's my pause for you to get the dumb joke I just made. But yeah, she said it. She, it was really fun. And it's true. If you look around the room, students will be smiling, they'll be laughing. Dare I say they are thinking it's a very fun experience because they're working together, they got that energy, and they can really show off their learning together. So think about group quizzes, think about group exams as a little middle extension here, a little more exotic twist of the traditional quizzes and exams you might give your students. Okay, last thing I'll say here before we wrap is thinking about authenticity. So I talked about that briefly earlier with the fixing the pipe example, right? You want to be authentic. You want to actually fix the pipe. So you get your hands dirty again. Yeah, you get that big plumber's wrench out and plumber's tape and you fix the pipe. Or you keep your hands clean and you ask AI, hey, where's my local plumber? And you call him. Either way, you're being authentic. You're actually fixing the pipe. With assessment, same thing. So we have these multiple choice quizzes, we have written essays, we have all these things that we use, but are they actually real? Are these things students will actually do in their careers? Probably not. Sure, they might take an MCAT or an NCLEX or a GRE, and those are those types of tests, but those aren't actual things you do in your career. So by being authentic, we want to try to match the assessment to a real world product. And I'll give a link in the notes too that shows some different resources for being authentic and how you make authentic assessments. Okay, so one example of this I want to share with you is what I did in my Introduction to Biomedical Engineering course. And I have this published on my website too. You can find it on the materials tab. I have a link there to a folder with a ton of free materials, including these assessment ideas. But this one was for Intro to BME, and it was the NSF GRFP. So this is the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship Proposal. This is a real thing. Okay, so this is a real award seniors in college can apply to, or first or second year grad students can apply to in STEM. And part of this application package, they have to write a 2-page research proposal. And this is a real science research proposal. Do you actually do it in the lab? No, but you have to write it to basically show that you can think logically about a problem. You can propose a solution and experimental plan to accomplish your research goals. So in our Intro to Biomedical Engineering course, I had students actually write the real 2-page NSF GRFP over the course of 15 weeks. We followed the exact guidelines and specifications with font, page limits, references, formatting, all these technical logistical pieces, but then we broke it up. So it wasn't just at the end of the course they had to turn it in. About every 2 weeks they had a deliverable. First, they had to submit their research question, then they had to submit their hypothesis, then they had to submit a literature review and their experimental plan, their broader impacts. All of this along the way, they got feedback from each other. We did online anonymous Canvas reviews. I gave them feedback. We also did in-person peer feedback where twice later on in the semester, they brought in 3 copies actually printed out. Yes, we used paper and we printed them out, and they had to sit across from each other at a table, look each other in the eye. They took 10 minutes to read each other's, and then they had 5 minutes to actually discuss the feedback with their peer. So they got live peer feedback and peer review. We also did a mock peer review panel at the end of the semester where they got to score each other's proposals. It turns out my students are very generous. They funded over 95%, if I remember correctly, of the proposals, whereas the actual funding rate is about 10% for NSF. So again, very generous students, but it was fun to do. And then I also used AI, and this was early on. This was 2024, but I used AI to give feedback. I told them what I was doing, and 95% of the students said it was helpful and accurate. And the reason I did that was because I had so many different topics: gold nanoparticles for cancer treatment, prosthetics, genetic engineering of plants, all these different topics I have no technical expertise in, but I was able to use an early form of one of the AI LLMs to help me give feedback. And again, I told them what I was doing, was very honest about it because I didn't have the technical expertise, and the students received it very positively. So I'd encourage you to consider having students use AI tools to give feedback and get feedback on their writing, not to write it for them, but to get feedback on their writing as a writing partner in future assignments. So with this project, again, now students could actually take that 2-page proposal and use it in their application if they wanted to. They could submit it to the NSF GRFP program if they wanted to. I don't know if any students did, but I have had students go on to graduate school from that class. And again, they could have used this as an exercise to help them with proposal writing now in their future academic and technical careers. So making that This is a real thing again. It's an authentic assessment. It shows that students can write a proposal, think through a scientific problem, propose experiments, and tie in their biomedical engineering knowledge. So be authentic. It's a great way to add to your STEM courses. Harder to do maybe in a 400-person intro bio class, but I think there's ways you can definitely do it. And I'd love to brainstorm that with you sometime. Okay, so those are my thoughts on assessment here. Again, a lot more in my book if you want to get more details on what I think about summative assessment. But key takeaways from this episode: make sure these summative assessments are aligned. They actually measure what you're intending them to measure with your learning objectives. Think along that continuum from more traditional quizzes and exams to maybe more exotic group quizzes, projects in the middle, and then also think about being authentic and how you can make these assignments actually matter. Because if you want our students to actually take these assessments seriously and not use AI to do them all for them, make them worth their time. Make them worthwhile, make them personal and connected to what they want to do in their lives. It's not just busy work. It actually means something. And I think they'll take it a lot more seriously and want to use that organic matter between their ears to do it all themselves. Okay. So that's it for summative assessments today on this episode. We'll come back on the next episode next week. But as always, please let me know if you have feedback. Let me know if these topics are landing with you and if you want me to cover anything else. And please do check out my website to see how I can help bring these topics to life for you in your university and your colleagues in your departments. I'd love to work with you and come visit you on campus or work with you virtually and help you make your STEM courses the best possible they can be. So thanks, everybody. Take care. Happy teaching.